One of the most interesting things and one of the most amazing things about cheese is that all cheeses basically are made with the same 4 ingredients. And you can get this amazing diversity of cheeses just from those same 4 starting materials, depending on the path that the process takes in turning that liquid into a solid. So it's diversity from simplicity, in a way.
Today, we're going to find out about the science of cheese, how they're made, why they taste so good, and we're going to do a quick cheese tasting as well. My name is Isla, and I'm from the Royal Institution.
And I'm Bronwen Percival. I'm the technical director for Neal's Yard Dairy, and with my husband Francis, I wrote a book called Reinventing the Wheel: Milk, Microbes, and the Fight for Real Cheese. And I'm really excited to be talking with you today.
Thank you for being here, Bronwen. Tell me, what are the basics of cheese? What are the ingredients, and what are kind of the basic steps?
So basically, cheese is really fascinating because it essentially takes the same 4 ingredients, milk, an enzyme called rennet, salt, and microbes, and can transform them into the thousands of different kinds of cheese that we know and love. Cheese making as a process, though, is particularly interesting because, in a way, it hijacks the way in which milk behaves in the digestive system. And if you've ever taken care of a newborn infant for any length of time, you'll notice that sometimes when they are drinking milk and they burp up, what comes up isn't liquid milk, but is actually cheesy curds. And that is because the first step of milk digestion in an infant mammal's stomach is coagulation, that the stomach releases an enzyme that is very similar to the rennet that we use in cheese making, which essentially takes liquid milk and cuts the proteins in such a way that instead of repelling one another, they stick together into a gel. And so the reason why that's important in the stomach is because then that gel can drain. So you leave the fats and the proteins in this sort of gel-like structure, but the liquid part that contains the lactose drains out of it within the stomach, and it can be quickly absorbed for digestion in the bloodstream. Meanwhile, these fats and proteins, which take a little bit longer to digest, can stay in the smaller curd in the stomach while then they begin to be broken down and empty from the stomach more slowly. So essentially, that coagulation process has evolved as part of milk, as part of the function of milk. And actually what cheese making does is it takes that process out of the stomach and into the vat, essentially. So you can take the same enzyme that's produced by the stomach lining of the baby calf or goat or sheep, extract it, add it to milk, and get it to set into into a gel. And depending on the route that you use to take to make your cheese, you can drain it a lot. To make a hard cheese, you can drain it a little bit to make a soft cheese. You can drain it in an acid environment to make quite a flaky textured cheese, or you can drain it in quite a sweet environment to make a glossy cheese, like this Tunworth that we see sitting right here.
And the microbes and the salt, what kind of role do they play?
So the microbes arguably are playing the more important role of those two functions, because cheese making isn't just the removal of the liquid, it's also a process of fermentation and of acidification, and you can't do that without microbes. So in the stomach, you have acid that's produced by the stomach, which creates acidity in a way that when you're working in the cheese vat, you're not getting an external source of acidity. So milk originally, for thousands of years when people have been making cheese, they haven't known about the microbiology of cheese making. They haven't known about the role of microbes in performing that acidification process. But because of the way that milk was produced, because of the fact that it had never been refrigerated, and because of the fact they weren't working in a sanitary environment where they were using lots of antimicrobial substances and so forth, there were a lot of naturally occurring microbes in that milk. And those microbes were the ones that then performed this role of acidification, which plays a really important role in terms of digesting the lactose that's present in the milk and making the cheese then more digestible. But also acidity production performs a really important process on actually how those curds behave. The same curds that would drain very, very slowly in a sweet environment, when you start adding acidity to that mix, they start to contract and seize up and expel moisture. And that actually, it promotes, that acidity helps with the digestion process. In the cheese making process, where the goal is actually to take the moisture out of that curd, the microbes in that acidification are performing a really important role.
There is a lot of science in
There's
cheese.
a huge amount of science. It is science, and that's one of the things that I really love about it. Salt also plays a really important role in terms of preservation. So the microbes, they acidify. That acidity is there as a preservative, but equally it's very difficult to make a cheese that lasts for a long time without the appropriate amount of salt. And so while salt doesn't entirely stop microbes in their tracks, it changes the water activity of the cheese environment, and that has big ramifications for how the microbes behave, how their enzymes behave within the cheese curd, and for the flavors that come out.
I'd love to get cracking into the cheese.
Excellent.
Which one do you think we should try first?
Let's start with the Tunworth right here.
Okay, the soft looking
Yes.
one. Okay.
This is a camembert style cheese. It's made in Hampshire.
Okay.
A little bit of cabbagey funk.
It's smelly.
Yes.
It's got that distinctive
Good.
cheese smell. I've gone all in.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that's a nice demonstration of what this cheese sets out to do. It's got a nice silky paste. The rind, you can feel it between your teeth, but it's not sticking around too much. And the aromas are nice, kind of mushroomy, cabbagey. Really, those aromas and flavors are released during the breakdown of the paste. So the microbes that started out within that curd, some of them have died because it's not a particularly nice environment for them inside a cheese. It's salty, it's acid, and so forth. They get a bit stressed. They burst open. They release their enzymes into the curd, and then those enzymes actually go to work on the proteins and the fats in the curd, and that's what releases smaller and smaller volatile molecules that then give you lots of interesting flavors and aromas.
Now, you said that cheese that we had smelt of cabbage, and I've never thought of cheese smelling like cabbage, but that's exactly what it is. Tell me a bit about what creates that aroma.
So the cabbage smell in cheese is actually a sulfur compound, just like you would find in a cruciferous vegetable, and it's released when you have proteins that are broken down that contain sulfur. And so as you've got your proteins that are, your caseins, which are the milk proteins that form this curd, and then as they're broken down by different microbes, you get different sort of smaller peptides, and then after that, amino acids as the cheese breaks down more and more fully. And different microbes have different sets of enzymes, and some of the enzymes that are particularly prevalent in the rind bacteria of camembert style cheese, those bloomy white rind bries and camemberts that everybody think of as having this kind of barnyardy, kind of funky sulfurous aroma, are actually taking sulfur-containing amino acids and breaking them down further into volatile sulfur compounds. So it is really sulfur, just like you would see in a cabbage, just coming from milk proteins.
And are all camemberts made from the same microbe?
That is a very interesting question. When my husband and I were researching our book, we went to Normandy to look at camembert production, and specifically as a place where there are a lot of scientists who've been doing a lot of work on milk microbes. And the interesting and somewhat counterintuitive thing is that they have legions of microbiologists in Normandy actually doing research on farm microbes that are important to camembert production. But when you look at the way in which camembert is produced, the way in which that industry is constituted, most of the camembert de Normandy, the raw milk ladled by hand, camembert is actually made from the milk of many, many different farms and driven by cultures that are added to that milk in the factories, essentially. And so it's very sort of ironic that here's this cheese whose flavor and aroma really reminds everyone of the farmyard, where actually they figured out how to add snowy white molds and how to add cultures that are specifically designed to create those aromas, and that those have become synonymous with the identity of camembert. So in a way, camembert is this fascinating cheese because I don't think it's necessarily the most milk expressive cheese. It's a cheese where you can take milk that's very clean and create those flavors in the factory by adding these very specifically isolated strains of lactic acid bacteria and ripening bacteria and molds.
Yeah, right. I wanted to ask you a bit about the history of cheese. I know you've touched on this a bit before, but tell me, how long have we been making cheese for, and how did it all start?
Well, I don't think anyone really knows the answer to that question entirely, but what's clear is that people have been coagulating and preserving milk for thousands and thousands of years. And there's some very interesting anthropologists out there who are looking at, archaeological sites where they find pot shards which have holes in them, and which they have done, analysis of the residues on those potsherds and see that actually they were making cheese, thousands and thousands of years ago, probably about the same time as they were domesticating these animals to get the milk from them in the first place. And in a way, it makes perfect sense because you have animals that, by and large, give milk during the summer. And that, this milk has incredible nutritional value, but you've got a lot of it when you got it, and then you've got months and months without it when the animals dry off. And that actually cheese making is this tremendous technology for taking the excess moisture out of this milk, so shrinking it by a factor of 10, getting rid of the lactose by the fermentation of the milk so that you make it more digestible, and preserving it so that you can eat it in the wintertime as well. So it's this brilliant technology, and it's in a way not surprising that there was intense evolutionary pressure for people to figure that out as quickly as possible when they were starting to deal with fluid milk as a food source.
Absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. Can we try our second one?
Yeah,
do you think?
Let's do it.
All right, which one are we going for now?
Let's go for this one because I think in many ways it's at the opposite end of the spectrum from a camembert style cheese in terms of its approach to microbiology.
Okay.
This is a cheese called St. James, and it's made in Cumbria by Martin Gott and his partner Nicola Robinson on their farm. They have sheep and they have goats, and so their other cheese is the goat's milk cheese that's sitting right next there across from it, and we can compare them. But the really interesting thing about these cheeses is that they use the microbes from the farm. In general, today, as with the camembert, the vast majority of cheeses are made using inoculated cultures, both the lactic acid bacteria that ferment the milk, but also the ripening cultures that then give you your stinky rinds or your mold growth or whatever. Those are all isolated strains that have been selected for their technical capacity to do certain roles, and people will add those to their milk, regardless of whether it's raw milk or pasteurized milk, to get the desired effect as they make their cheese. What Martin and Nicola have done, which I think is so unique and makes their cheeses so interesting, is that they've decided to approach their cheese making from a farm microcosm perspective and isolate their own cultures from their milk that then they use and inoculate into their own milk to make a cheese that's pretty much 100% a product of their farm. So you could argue they're getting their salt from off the farm, and I think they're buying in their rennet enzyme. But in terms of the ingredients and the things that we're tasting within this cheese, it is an expression of that farm.
Ooh, it kind of reminds me of chocolate.
That is another very perceptive comment. Sort of chocolatiness is something that we often get in ripened cheeses.
All right.
I think it's interesting because it is indeed a lower acid cheese, and I think that is contributing to that kind of very round, quite mellow, quite rich impression. And I think one of the interesting things is that in some ways, despite using all of its own microbes, and you might think that's going to be a much wilder cheese to eat, it's actually quite mild-mannered.
How do we select the microbes that we want?
It's a really interesting question because I feel like cheese making is a process of microbial selection. Essentially, the cheesemaker's job is to build a house, and that house is the cheese curd, and the characteristics of that curd are naturally going to select for the kind of microbes we want to grow there. And obviously, we don't have a catalog of what's growing naturally on the outside of these cheeses. There's a certain degree of, it's very important as cheesemakers, and particularly cheesemakers working with raw milk, that we know that there are no pathogens in the cheeses because we don't want to make people sick. It's not good for business. It's not good for anybody. So we need to make sure that there are no pathogens present. But for cheese, there are probably 4 or 5 important pathogens that we need to be aware of. But that's within the context of thousands and thousands of different species of bacteria and molds, all of which are interesting and potentially good and flavorful and unique to farms. So by building, what essentially have been the 4 different houses that are the cheeses that were on our cheese plate, we've selected for different groups of bacteria. And that may be to do with how high we're cooking the curd, different kinds of lactic acid bacteria like warmer temperatures versus cooler temperatures. It may be how moist the curd is when it's acidifying. Some like moister environments, some like drier environments. A lot of it will have to do, particularly with the soft cheeses, with the kind of environment that they're matured in. So what's the humidity, what's the temperature, what's the airflow? All of those, even tiny differences of half a degree, when you carry that out over the maturation of a cheese, can make a huge difference in which microbes win that evolutionary race to dominate that environment. And the more complexity you have, I think the consensus is, the more complexity, the more diversity of enzymes, the more different and complex the flavor.
You mentioned both bacteria and molds, which are two different things. Can you tell me a bit about the difference between them in the context of cheese?
Absolutely. So bacteria are the ones that are a certain subset of bacteria, the lactic acid bacteria, are the ones that are responsible for taking the lactose in milk and digesting it into lactic acid. And that is absolutely fundamental to the cheese making process. So I would say pretty much, not every cheese, but the vast majority of cheeses are using these lactic acid bacteria to do that process. That doesn't mean they're the only bacteria that are involved in cheese making, but the other bacteria and the molds really come into play when it comes time for cheese aging. So the thing about the bacteria is that they can grow inside the cheese when it's aging, or they can grow on the outside of the cheese when it's aging. Molds, because they like oxygen, tend to grow on the surface of the cheese. Or if you have something like a blue cheese, the cheesemaker is setting out self-consciously to create a cheese with holes on the inside of it, which will then have air so that those molds can grow internally. So yeah, molds and fungi, molds and yeast, they need air. You find them where there's air. Bacteria, they can be, and they are spread throughout the cheese and on the cheese surface.
We've talked a fair bit about the science of cheese. Obviously, we want to study it to get better tasting cheeses, but is there an application beyond that?
Such an interesting question, and I'm really glad you asked that, because I think in some ways I'm interested in cheese science for exactly the reason that you state, because better cheese is better for the industry, and I'm excited by the prospect of better cheese. But actually, there's some with the rise of really high throughput DNA sequencing and metagenomics, actually there are a number of scientists who are approaching artisan cheese as a really interesting model that they can use to study microbial interactions and community formation. So I actually was lucky enough to spend 2 months in the lab of Rachel Dutton and Ben Wolfe at Harvard back in 2014, and the point of their research was not necessarily to study artisan cheese. In fact, they weren't really that interested in the artisan cheeses at all, but Rachel had this brilliant idea that looking at cheese rinds was interesting because, unlike the gut microbiome, this is a bacterial or a microbial community that's easy to study in the lab. You don't have to have anaerobic conditions. It grows at fairly comfortable temperatures, and you can make tiny little experimental cheeses and grow things and actually start to look at how these intensely complex communities of microbes are growing together, are forming, are communicating with one another, and start to use the phenomena that we're finding happening on the outside of these cheese rinds to inform our understanding of how microbial communities form, which I'm sure, as you know, with all of the interest right now in things like the gut microbiome and health, is really pertinent within the scientific community in general. And the most important thing about that at all, and for me the most beneficial, is we as a cheese industry got a huge amount of information from their study of sort of 130 artisan cheeses and their rinds, where they were able to do very kind of in-depth sequencing of the communities of molds and bacteria growing on the outside of these cheeses. It was revolutionary for us as an industry to start to understand, like, what's there. But actually for them, looking at these cheeses as opposed to the sort of much simpler cheeses that you would find in the supermarket, say, where you're working with milk that's been pasteurized and with, a kind of note-by-note approach to making a cheese with only known quantities in terms of microbial strains. They're very simple systems, whereas actually using these artisan cheeses gave you much, much more complexity, but actually scientifically a much more interesting thing to study. So yes, I think cheeses have played an important role in starting to help us understand those community interactions, even at a very simplified level.
So are you saying that studying microbes within the context of cheese is kind of a better representation of what happens out in nature?
I think what it allowed them to do was to create artificial small communities using strains that they had isolated from these cheeses. And again, our knowledge, particularly in 2014, and I think probably still, is really at the very rudimentary stages of, microbiology for a long time was about isolating one thing and seeing how it grew and characterizing it. But actually then when you start to look at 2 things growing together, or 3 things, or 4 things, or 5 things, suddenly it gets exponentially more complex. But because they have these very interesting new tools that let us look at whole communities, in a snapshot using enormous amounts of computational power, you can sort of see what's there in all of its complex glory, but then you can start to select different members of those communities to start putting them together in captivity and looking not just at who wins, but like what are the mechanisms by which they're interacting with one another. Because understanding those mechanisms, that's the basis for understanding everything about how microbes operate in the real world, because the real world is extremely diverse.
What's our next one, Bronwen?
All right, let's try the ingot. This is another cheese made by Martin and Nicola at Holker Farm. This is made with the milk of their herd of goats.
Ooh, it does have that distinctive like goat smell. A goat's cheese, as you said. It's very creamy, very soft.
Probably quite acid as well.
Oh, that sourness is really hitting me now.
Quite lemony almost. And it's interesting that you say about the goatiness, because I absolutely agree. One of the characteristics of goat's cheese is that typical goatiness. And it's interesting that different fatty acids from different breeds of animal, that they have different long chains, and those give rise to the particular kind of goaty flavor of goat's cheese, or like sheepy flavor of sheep's cheese. Sometimes you get this really kind of lanolin-y flavor, and that's because of different fats in the different milks. And as they start to break down, again, when they're whole, just like milk proteins, when they're whole they don't taste like much, but when they start to break down, the free fatty acids that they release have these very specific and very kind of memorable and evocative flavors and aromas.
Yeah. What do you think is the biggest threat to artisanal cheese today?
One of the biggest threats to this style of cheese and to cheese flavor in general is what I think of as a sort of Pasteurian mentality. You know, everything in our lives and I think COVID-19 has actually been working against us slightly in this respect, in that people get the sense that things have to be sterile to be clean. And actually, when you apply that to something that's a fermented food that depends for its flavor on naturally occurring communities of microbes within milk and cheese, a Pasteurian mentality is antithetical to flavor, and actually in many ways we're seeing more and more antithetical to safety, that really well-produced raw milk is teeming with interesting and diverse microorganisms, and that by being able to harness them, we can actually use them to our advantage to push out the ones that we don't want, and to end up with cheeses, each of which taste uniquely of the farm that it came from. I think the risk is that so often, and often because of the liquid milk industry, which prizes a lack of microbes within milk for obvious reasons. You don't want your milk to go off before the use-by date. And if you have milk that's teeming with bacteria, you can pasteurize that milk, but the bacteria that survive pasteurization will still end up with milk with a shortened shelf life. So everything about the way in which milk producers have been taught to make good milk is kind of working against what makes good and interesting cheese. And asking people to unlearn that, particularly when all of these cheesemakers, I think, by and large and understandably, are concerned about getting the wrong microbes in there and, you know, making someone ill, it's a really difficult mentality shift. But it's very, very important, because the risk is that even people making cheese with raw milk, if they're making cheese with milk that's produced in a way to disrupt the flow of microbes from the farm into the milk and to make the milk that's as clean as possible, they can make what a cheese consultant friend of mine calls not clean milk, but dead milk. And then at that point, why are you even bothering to use raw milk in the first place? It doesn't have any of the inherent personality or specialness. And you can end up making raw milk cheeses on 5 different farms using bought-in cultures that all taste exactly the same. And so for me, the biggest risk is that you end up with this like a decrease in diversity even happening before our very eyes.
No one wants that.
No, I don't think so. I don't want that. Yeah, and I think what we're trying to work on, and I think the biggest challenge for me and my work at Neil Jarre Dairy is really trying to help people understand what their unique resources are and then bring those through in the cheeses as much as possible.
One last cheese, Bronwen. Right. What is this one?
So this is a very special cheese called Havid. It's a cheddar made on the oldest organic dairy farm in Wales, made from a herd of Ayrshire cows, which are a native breed to the UK. A very interesting, very kind of old-fashioned farm. So this is a cheese where they've adjusted the way that they're making the cheese to slow it down, to make room for more diversity of those microbes to really show through in the finished product, but they've also been doing a lot of experimentation with the way they're milking the cows. So instead of, blitzing the teats with lots of antimicrobial chemicals, they're actually using wood shavings to just do a dry wipe of the teats of the cows to conserve the native bacteria that are living on those teats, which actually a lot of the research in France has shown is really important for not only acidification, but also like ripening flavor. So it's a case study in optimization of milk for interesting cheese.
All right.
Let's do it.
Oh, that's very sharp.
You can taste that acidity again, just like in the goat's cheese. If you get closer to the rind, there's almost a kind of a cellar, sort of musty smell.
I don't know if woody is the right word, but it does remind me of like a barn or a barrel or something like that.
Totally. I think that is a lot of the smells that are released by the molds that are growing on the outside of the cheese. There's this almost earthy. Scent that comes from a very particular compound called geosmin, which is released by a lot of these wild type molds, like penicillium molds that will grow on the outside of cheeses. And say, for example, the penicillium that's on the outside of the Tunworth, that's a mutant that doesn't have any of the colored spores that we associate with like the mold that might grow on a loaf of bread, say, for example, or on a Roquefort cheese. But actually, it's also lost some of the wild type mold's capacity to create that kind of bread mold musty taste, because nobody really likes that on the outside of their cheese.
No. You obviously speak very passionately about your cheeses. What's your background? What brought you to cheese science?
I think nobody who ends up working in the cheese industry, I mean, unless they've grown up on a farm where cheese is produced, has ever thought when they were young that they were going to grow up and work with cheese. Just not one of the career paths that's presented. And as a result, you get a group of people with very diverse and interesting backgrounds, kind of all having come to something because they really enjoy it. In my case, I studied biochemistry, and I was looking at medical school as a potential medical school and research as a potential way of kind of indulging my love of science and asking questions and kind of finding answers. And I sort of got diverted by 2 years in the Peace Corps, which is a sort of volunteer organization run by the US government that sends Americans to live abroad. I lived in Senegal in a herding community in northern Senegal with no, electricity or running water. But one thing they did have was cows, and they were using fermentation, not to make cheese, but to make a lot of kind of soured milk yogurts and butter oils and so forth, preserving the milk from their animals to really be a staple of their diets. And I just thought, wow, this is so fascinating. I've always loved food. Looking at anthropology, food practices and so forth could be really interesting. Anyway, after that, I came back to the UK and did a master's in anthropology, and then for my dissertation looked at the cheese and ideas of tradition and how so many of these cheeses are sold as traditional, but actually if you start to scrape the surface, what appears or is being sold as traditional is actually quite a modern construction of things that are fitting the market's expectations, which of course they should be. But anyway, in the course of doing the research for that project, I came to Neal's Yard Dairy to interview the owner, and thought that would be a pretty cool place to work. And then next thing you know, here I am almost 20 years later. So yeah.
Bronwen, you've certainly changed my view of cheese. I don't think I'll ever eat cheese the same way. And these have been really delicious. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, it's been a pleasure.